Okay, Dhyana Yoga, yoga of meditation, or centering in the self. So this whole point about, being centered in ourselves, remaining absorbed, the mind gets absorbed in the sense, in the self, and therefore that is where we center ourselves and remain there. And this is the whole kind of purpose of going through the meditation practice. So the themes in chapter number 6, we are going to look at tonight, the logic and flow of thought so far. So just to connect the flow of thought right from the very beginning, this is what I do in every session so that we kind of remind ourselves where we have come from and where we are going. So we started by considering the last two verses of the previous chapter, where Lord Krishna, as usual, introduces the next chapter. And here he gives a very kind of broad outline of what meditation is and what is the basis of meditation. Then Karma Yogi and the Sannyasi. This is again a continuation of the discussion from the last chapter, because if you remember, the last chapter was talking about karma sannyas and where that fits into the journey of the seeker as he travels along from being in a distressed condition, just like Arjuna, up to a point whereby he is ready to give up his action. In other words, his sense of doership is going to be given up at that stage. Then the mind. So what is the mind? The mind, friend or foe? Because at the center of our sadhana, at the center of our practice is the mind. And just like in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali says, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means the mind, which is now become totally silent, is your friend. So we will look at what Lord Krishna says about the mind and its relationship to the self. And the accomplished jnani, which then he describes in three verses, who is this accomplished jnani. And again, it gives us a framework within to which to think about our own journey, where we are, and how much we have attained in terms of our own practice. And then the technique of meditation itself, which takes up the bulk of the chapter from verse number 10 to verse number 32. And in this portion of this chapter, there are various different sections as well, which I'll point out as we come to this particular section. Then Arjuna asked the question, this time he asked question at the end rather than at the beginning. So Arjuna's question is about the mind. And remembering that what Lord Krishna was talking about in verse number 5 and 6, Arjuna asked the question to Lord Krishna about the mind and how fickle it is. And, he doesn't see how this can be of any help in sitting down to meditate. And then Arjuna asked another question, which is related to what he had asked about the mind. And what if time runs out and you have not attained the final state of liberation or the final state of realization? Then what happens? So Lord Krishna then gives him the answer to that as well. And then in the last two verses, Lord Krishna then introduces the next chapter, which is going to be continuation of the journey about Jnana and Vijnana. So this is the kind of outline of the chapter and what we're going to follow through for today. And after the technique of meditation from verse number 10 to 32, after verse number 32, we have talked about, then I will do the meditation so that you can relate the practice to what we have reflected upon on the technique of meditation itself. And then, of course, the last one is what will you do now? Your own homework over the next 1 month, what you need to do. And I hope you've been following for the last 6 months, all the exercises which have been given to you. And as much as you can kind of stick to doing some of the homework, I'm sure that you will find it absolutely beneficial because of course it's based on Lord Krishna's teaching, and the Bhagavad Gita is a very practical text which gives us exactly what to do in terms of our day-to-day practice. Okay, so let's begin with the flow of thought. and what we have covered so far. And like I was saying that, we have seen the overview of the Bhagavad Gita in session 1, the setting of the teaching itself. Session number 2, we talked about Arjuna's condition, how Arjuna's distressed condition has led him to say, I don't want to fight. Here's the greatest warrior in the middle of the battlefield, and he is saying, I don't want to fight, a great Kshatriya who is rejecting as if his own duty in the middle of the battlefield. And what Bhagwan's response is, and we see the overview of the guidance in chapter number 2, and in session number 3, we talked about Bhagwan's response in detail and the overall teaching, Sankhya Yoga, Karma Yoga, and the outcome of Sankhya and Karma Yoga practice, which is the person of perfection who gets established in the knowledge itself. So in this chapter, chapter number 2, it gives the essence of the whole of the Bhagavad Gita. And then Lord Krishna takes us step by step into the more refined picture of what this pathway is all about. And as we have seen, it gets more and more refined in terms of what needs to be done, what stages there are, and so on and so on. And in session number 4, this is Karma Yoga, chapter number 3, and the nature of action. And not only the individual action, but the cosmic dimension of action, which is yajna, or sacrifice, which then in the individual expresses itself in a certain way. And this is expressed in relationship to Karma Yoga, and how Karma Yoga is in essence a way of sacrificing something. And we begin to understand what that sacrifice is in terms of our individual spiritual practice related to Karma Yoga. And then how to perform action in the world, because this is what needs to be established first of all as the initial beginning, the beginning of our spiritual journey. How to perform action with what kind of belief, what kind of attitude, what kind of intention. And this Lord Krishna gives in a lot of detail about how to do it. And then towards the end of the chapter, he says, the enemy within is really the desire. This is the desire, which is an expression of our vasanas, the subliminal inclination and tendencies which give rise to thoughts and feelings, and which kind of collate into a desire which is intended towards the world of objects, names, and forms. And this really is the enemy within, and we understand this enemy as something which keeps us locked up in our state of ignorance. Why? Because desire is the one which pushes us into a state of performing action in a kind of very egoistic, selfish way, and therefore it creates a sense of the rootedness in our ego identity. So this is why it is the enemy within. And of course, Arjuna understands the language of the enemy, and therefore Lord Krishna is telling him, this is the enemy which you got to conquer. You can see the enemy in front of you, as it were, across the battlefield, but really speaking, what we have to think about in terms of this inner transformation, the landscape which is inside yourself, which needs to change, is through the destruction of this enemy called desire. And then finally, he talks about a relationship between action and knowledge. And then he goes on to the next chapter, which was renunciation of action in knowledge. So this is where now the knowledge begins to take a prominent position in terms of how we are functioning in the world. And Lord Krishna here gives the revelation of his own divinity, and says that I am the divine. I have taken this incarnation in this human form through the manipulation of my own Maya, and I declare now the purpose of my incarnation. And he says that he has come to re-establish dharma because there is an imbalance towards a dharma, and to protect the righteous and to deal with those who are the unrighteous. Action, knowledge, and its relationship to the divine becomes clearer in terms of the Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Saguna Upasana, which is Bhakti Yoga, and Jnana Yoga, which is Nirguna Dhyanam. Now, this Nirguna Dhyanam is actually where we are going to be thinking about in terms of chapter number 6. And then session number 6, true renunciation. So we are moving along from an ego identified individual, slowly by slowly giving up this sense of me and mine. In other words, the identification with this body-mind intellect and this individuality is beginning to diminish with the practice of karma yoga, bhakti yoga, and taking us towards karma sannyas, which means disidentification with the action itself, so that the sense of doership also begins to diminish and disappear. And this is really when he talks about true renunciation. What is true renunciation? And Arjuna's question, which is about, uh, which pathway do I follow? Do I follow the path of karma yoga or karma sannyas? Because karma sannyas in his mind is about renunciation of action. And Lord Krishna says, no, you have to start with where I'm telling you to start with is karma yoga, and then karma sannyas can follow after that, unless you are already prepared to renounce your sense of action or doership uh, already with a prepared mind. Then you can be elevated to that particular stage of the pathway because you have maybe done all that work in your previous life. But for the time being, that you have to follow through in terms of karma yoga and then karma sannyas. And then, of course, becoming Brahmanishta, which means establishing oneself in the in the ultimate reality of Brahman. And this is through Jnana Nishtha, establishing oneself in the knowledge, and through the intellectual knowledge which one becomes convinced and is centered in, one then begins to move towards the state of realization. And in this chapter also we saw Karma Yoga as the spectrum of the sadhakas. So these sadhaks who are starting from a complete state of ignorance, then step on to the spiritual pathway, and how they come right at the end, become Atmavit, which means they become realized in their own true nature. So Jnani and the Atmavit. And this is where true renunciation is now continuation of this journey, whereby we go from Karma Yoga to the Jnana Yoga, and then Jnana Nishtha, which is the Atmavit or Brahmanishta. And then, of course, at the end, he gives us the 2 verses on the basis of meditation, which is the introduction to chapter number 6. So this is now, very briefly, the overall kind of flow of thought, ideas, the journey, which Lord Krishna is slowly unfolding for Arjuna as he becomes engaged with the dialogue, and he begins to understand what this is all about. So remember again, there is knowledge, there is practice, and there is transformation. And unless the practice is there, one can have all the knowledge in the world, but without the practice, there is no inner transformation, which is of any significance. There may be some transformation because our thoughts begin to flow in a different direction, but that requires for us to manifest this knowledge into our day-to-day practice, and that requires for us to practicing the precept, as it were, and then to go on from precept and the practice to the inner transformation. So what then is the process is what we are talking about here is selfless action, karma yoga, knowledge of the self, jnana yoga, and self-realization, jnana nishtha. So this is the kind of overall journey which one is taking from the state of complete ignorance, and karma yoga, jnana yoga, and jnana nishtha. This is the pathway, this is the destination. And within this, as we see, there are so many kind of subsections of the journey. There are techniques which are given. There are ideas about how this is related to the individual and the relationship of the individual to the world, and the relationship of the world to the total cosmos. So there is a lot of detail which goes off in all this chapter about this broader understanding of the spiritual journey. So let's look at this spiritual journey. Then, one way of looking at it is to go back to what Lord Krishna was talking about in the previous chapter, which is we start with karmi. Karmi is the one who is the karta bhokta, which means he is the doer and he's the enjoyer. And this karmi is the one who has not yet started on the journey. And we can say that maybe, Arjuna can be described as in this condition whereby he sees himself as a doer of the action. And as a doer of the action, he gets into a state of distress. Why? Because he sees the consequences of his doership, and he sees that even the enjoyership he's going to get out of winning the battle is not going to be worth it. So karmi is the one who is totally identified with the body, mind, intellect, the ego, individuality, and sees himself or herself as the doer of actions and the enjoyer of the fruits of the actions. So that is the first one. Then stepping onto the spiritual pathway is the karma yogi, who is karta, but he begins to go towards abhokta, which means the enjoyership is being given up slowly by doing what? By giving up the fruit of the action. In other words, that when I do an action, it is about attaining some result, and therefore my attachment is to the result, and my sense of that particular result which I'm going to get is about enjoying the result. And this slowly, when one begins to give up or renounce the karma phalam, which means the fruit of the action, one is then establishing oneself as a karma yogi. Then karma sannyasi is the akarta abhokta to a certain extent, because he has now brought in this knowledge which begins to influence how he is thinking and being in the world and being in relationship to the world, so that even the sense of I am the doer begins to slowly diminish. Okay. And here then what happens is that the focus begins to turn just on the spiritual pathway. Now, as I was saying in the last talk, that there are people who, even at a young age, they have this sense of dispassion and detachment towards the world and the activities of the world and the ambitions of the world. And they say, no, no, this is not for me. For me, it is now following the spiritual pathway. So even at a young age, they take up this pathway and they begin to just focus on their spiritual life. And for most of the other people, then it becomes slowly by slowly increasing this karta bhav in our life through acquiring the knowledge and becoming kind of committed and convinced about this knowledge, so that it begins to affect the way in which we experience ourselves as the non-doer. And then the Jnana Yogi, who then is very much focused on the knowledge itself, to the exclusion of many of the other things which most of the grahasthis, or the people who are living a grahastha lifestyle, or the householder, those are not in the mind of this Jnana Yogi. He's only interested in knowledge and the practice of knowledge and the sense of becoming akarta and abhokta. So he goes even further than the karma sannyasi. And then the final one is the Atmavit. He has now reached completely a state of akarta abhokta. Therefore, there is no sense of doership. There is no sense of enjoyership. He gets established in the self. And you remember the self is now the ultimate destination in the spiritual pathway. And this is where one has to transcend the body, mind, intellect, ego, individuality. So there is no sense of doership, there's no enjoyership, there's no ego, individuality. One becomes established in the infinite reality. So this is the pathway which has now, as you can see, Karma Yoga, Jnana Nishta, there are now, we can see there are different kind of stages which are there in between. So steady renunciation of the fruit of the action and action itself, disidentification from enjoyership and doership, slowly takes us towards the state of realization, Atmavit. And where does meditation fit into all this? This is now the stage whereby the Jnana Yogi who has become established more and more in this akarta abhokta bhava, then takes up the meditation in such a way that he begins to get established in the state of absorption in the self. And this is where the mind becomes so important. The absorption of the mind in the self is what meditation is all about. So remember, this is now the spiritual journey, and you know, each one of these has got a component which we have looked at so far. And as we travel further into the Bhagavad Gita, we will see that, you know, this particular section from chapter number 1 to chapter number 6 is about the individual. And this is the individual's journey towards the ultimate reality. And then from chapter number 7 right up to chapter number 12, it is about divinity, the truth, the ultimate reality, Brahman. It is going to describe the divinity in terms of the transcendental dimension, and also the transactional dimension in which divinity can be related to by the practitioner of all these techniques which he has shown so far. Okay, so basis of meditation, just to remind ourselves that in the last chapter, the last two verses were the beginning of Dhyana Yoga, introducing the topic in the last chapter. What is the technique? Shutting out all external context. In other words, that the context of the senses with the mind and the intellect, they are now completely shut out, fixing the gaze as though between the eyebrows, as though not that we knit the eyes and become cross-eyed. It means just as if you're kind of looking through the middle of the eyebrows and you kind of focus on a point which is about 1 or 2 feet in front of you. And this is fixing the gaze and equalizing the outgoing and the incoming breath moving within the nostrils. And this is the focusing on the breath, so that the ingoing, outgoing breath also becomes equalized, with senses, mind, intellect ever controlled, having liberation as a supreme goal, not anything else, only the goal of supreme goal, which is one of liberation, and then free from desire, fear, and anger. So even all the desires have been put aside, any kind of fear about anything, and anger, all the emotions have been put aside as well. Then what we are left with is a mind which is now prepared to get into the deep absorption. And when it does that and it stays there, the sage verily gets liberated forever. So these are the two verses at the end of last chapter. So what is the result? He says, knowing me as the enjoyer of sacrifices and austerities, the great Lord of all the worlds, the friend of all beings, he attains peace. So this is the Paramashanti, which is nothing but the state of realization. This is where the practice of meditation is going to take us. Lord Krishna is kind of describing it within the context of what he has already talked about, so that Arjuna understands that, you know, the sacrifices which are being made is really related to this enjoyer. Who is this enjoyer? This enjoyer is the self, and the self is there to it is a complex relationship, but, you know, we can simply describe that as the enjoyer of the sacrifices and the austerities. And one becomes established, centered in the self. So this is really the introduction to the whole chapter on the yoga of meditation. And Lord Krishna then continues a bit about the karma yogi and karma sannyasi from the previous chapter. And here what he's going to talk about is something very fundamental to the aspect of sannyas. And he kind of changes the whole idea about sannyas by talking about this thing called sankalpa sannyas. So let's see what he means. The yogi who, having reached the state through which through purification, karma yoga, has now come to a point of letting go of action. So karma yogi who has been practicing letting go of this enjoyership has now come to a state of purification through karma yoga, and is now at a point of letting go of action. And here Lord Krishna introduces this term called anashritaha, not depending on, not taking support from any karma phala. This is now the renunciation. Okay? Not depending on any result of action, and this is renunciation. Bhagwan says, you don't worry about the karma phala, because I will take care of your yoga, whatever you want, and protection of what you have. What you need and what you have, I will take care of that. You don't depend on any of the result of your action. Therefore, this yogi, he is now a sannyasi, and this sannyasi, he becomes a dhyani, a meditator. So karma yogi, karma sannyasi, jnana yogi, dhyani. Can you see the sequence now where we are following? So this is where Lord Krishna introduces the connection between renunciation, sannyas, and meditation, dhyana. And he says the one, he explains this in terms of the one who has renounced action and the one who has now come to a state of becoming a dhyani. He says not the one who has retired from doing normal actions and he has given up his daily rituals. Now, this is the retiree, the one who has gone into retirement from a grahastha ashram to a vanaprastha ashram, and then from vanaprastha he has gone to sannyas ashram. That sequence which is being followed is from a social perspective rather than from a spiritual perspective. So Lord Krishna is talking that, don't get this thing mixed up, because I'm speaking to you from this spiritual perspective, so that it's not about retiring and you say, okay, now I'm retired, I'm a sannyasi. Actually, you're not, because unless you have given up the sense of enjoyership and doership, you are still not a true sannyasi. So sankalpa sannyas, renunciation of thought itself. Now, this is, a very subtle concept to grasp. So we may have kind of been thinking about, the intellectual dimension, so that we are thinking and having this inner dialogue that I'm not the doer, I'm not the enjoyer, that this thought has come in my mind, I need to redirect it into a different direction, onto the path of shreyas rather than on the path of prayers. I need to reformulate my attitude. I need to reform my belief about, this, that, and the other. I need to think about my intention and how am I going to do it. There is a thought process which is going on in terms of our contemplative ability through the intellect, which will allow me to steer myself onto the spiritual pathway. Now, what he's talking about is sankalpa sannyas, which is now, okay, you renounce the karma phala. You renounce the karma itself. Now, Lord Krishna is saying renunciation of thought. So even the thought now is going to be renounced. In other words, you're stepping away from the whole thought process itself. And when you do that, what happens is that there is a renunciation of thought. So he says, no one can be a yogi, a dhyani in this context without renunciation of thought. And I'll explain what this means in terms of the overall kind of preparation of the mind. So yoga in this case is described as renunciation of thought. And sankalpa is what? Letting go of resolve or intentionality for the sake of me and mine. So sankalpa can be seen as a resolve. So you remember, even when we do our puja, at the very beginning, we make a sankalpa for the goodness of ourselves, to be on the spiritual pathway, or whatever sankalpa we have in the mind, we kind of express it, take a flower in our hand, put the other hand over it and put it on our knee and make this sankalpa. Now here, sankalpa means that you are taking a certain resolve, so that whatever puja you are going to do, whatever spiritual practice or ritual you're going to do, is going to fulfill that resolve which you have taken, which arises from your own intentionality for the sake of me and mine. So there are many different types of pujas, and of course, there are pujas to gain something, or to, to keep something which you already have. And these are the kind of Vedic rituals which we can be thinking about, but also in the sense that this is not what Lord Krishna is talking about. He's gone much further than that. He's talking about renunciation of the thought process itself. In other words, the renunciation of resolve, resolution, letting go of resolution. Now think about it. What does letting go of resolution mean? Which means that there is no kind of substance in the mind which is there, because the thought flow is there, which is arising because we have a resolution about something. And this resolution is an expression of our vasanas, inclinations, and tendencies. So when we are renouncing thought, we are putting a kind of gap between the vasanas and what was happening in the intellect itself, the mind and the intellect. And when we put that gap, there is the renunciation of thought. And this renunciation of the thought has the effect of making the mind to be quiet. Now, again, going back to Yoga Sutra, which says yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. And these vrittis of the mind, which are the modifications or the kind of waves which are coming in the mind, thought waves, those are completely still. Nirodha means complete stillness. And I will show how this particular chapter is very much connected to the Yoga Sutra, because each and every limb of the Ashtanga Yoga is actually included in this chapter. So resolve is about what? Resolve is I desire something that will give me happiness. And desire is also about that. Desire is that I desire something for the sake of me and mine so that it can give me the happiness which I want. I'm resolving to go out and get it. I'm expecting to get a certain result and I'm attached to this result. Think of this, that this whole sequence of things which is going on in the intellect as a thought form and a thought pattern. And if we let go of that complete thought pattern, imagine what happens to the mind. It becomes completely still because there is no desire. I don't want anything. I don't need to go out and get anything. And I don't need to perform any action. I'm not expecting any result, and I'm not attached to anything at all. So this is about sankalpa sannyas and letting go of the resolve or intentionality for the sake of me and mine. And it is important to kind of remind ourselves that, this is taking it one very subtle step forward, but very obvious in the sense of attaining the state of dhyana. So here's a cowboy. Now, I don't know whether you can call him a karma yogi or not, but here's a cowboy. And here's the cowboy who is now on the steed, on the horse, and completely in control. You can see how fast the horse is going. He is in complete control of the steed. Whereas before, he was learning how to mount the steed. And this very same idea is given to us in chapter number 6 by Lord Krishna. He says, the one who is desiring to mount the steed, Aruruksha, and the one who has mounted the steed, Yogarudha. So the idea is that we are going from desiring to mount to having mounted. In other words, we are now in complete control of the steed. And the steed represents what? The steed represents the mind. So in karma yoga, karma sannyasa, and the jnana which we are acquiring in these earlier stages, what does it do? It allows us to slowly by slowly gain control of the mind until the time when we have complete control of the mind. So much so control that we are able to even give up the sankalpa which is arising in the mind. Can you see how wonderful this knowledge is? That, step by step, it is telling us exactly what it is. And I've described these two stages, two kind of major stages which we talk about. Action is the means for somebody who is desiring to come onto the path of spirituality, and quiescence is the means for one who has reached a state of purification whereby he is now ready to renounce even the action. So you can see it is related to what we were talking about earlier. For the sage who wishes to attune to yoga, action is said to be the means. For the same sage, he's not saying for a different sage, for the same person, the journey continues, and who has attuned to yoga, quiescence is the means. So first of all, we have to attune to yoga. In other words, the yogic practices of karma yoga is so much a kind of first part that we are attuning ourselves to that way of living our life and living in relationship to the world in this particular way. And then once we have done that and we have mastered karma yoga, we move on to karma sannyas, and then quiescence becomes the means whereby we then go to the next stage of our journey. So who is a yoga ruda? Who is the one who has mounted? He gives us a description of this person who has reached this stage now. Not attached to sense objects, fruit of actions, not attached to action itself, karma sannyasi. All thoughts are renounced, sankalpa sannyas. And therefore, this is the one who is now totally in control of the mind. So again, reminding ourselves, karma yoga, karma sannyasa, jnana yoga, jnana nishtha. So now the yoga ruda, who has now mounted the steed of the mind, completely in control of it. And of course, this is the language which Arjun will absolutely understand, because he is a warrior, and he is, knows what it means to control the horse or the steed. And to control the mind, there is something to be done. And which means that through karma yoga, through karma sannyasa, we come to a state whereby we are now ready to renounce even the thought through the knowledge, and then go into jnana nishtha. So remember, the mind is at the center. Why is the mind at the center? Because we are now in a position to renounce even the mind. Because if you think of mind as a flow of thought, and if we renounce thought, then we have to make sure that the mind is our friend. Because if it's not our friend, we are not going to be able to do it. So is the mind a friend, or is it the enemy? Again, language which Arjuna would understand. So at the core of our sadhana is the mind. Mind has to be put into the right relationship with the self. And this is done through jnana. Jnana yoga gives us the basis on which we are going to come into the right relationship with the self. In other words, there needs to be a deep conviction, faith in the self, so that meaning Brahman, becomes the basis of meaning, purpose, values, MPV of one's own life. See how the relationship between ourselves in the transactional identity has to be in the right relationship with the ultimate transcendental reality, so that we can have the means and the basis of functioning in such a way that the mind is put into the right relationship with the self. And at the core of that is the mind. So when there is such a deep conviction, then what happens? Then self is alone is the friend of oneself, who has conquered one's mind. See, the mind is conquered now because of the practices which have preceded in the previous chapter that has been practiced, and the conquering of the mind has come about, and therefore the self becomes the friend. Why? Because the self is the one who is guiding. It's like a friend who is guiding you towards the right destination. And the friend is the one which is the pull towards which the mind is being attracted to, and therefore it proceeds in that direction. There is also the ability to lift oneself by one's own self and remain ascended, mounted. So the mind is now conquered. It is the friend of the self, or the self is the friend of the mind, and therefore they become like very close, intimate friends, so that one is kind of ascending into the other. This ability to lift oneself in and remain ascended, this is what we mean by the mind being the friend, and mounting means the state of yoga ruda. So this is when we have a deep conviction. So what happens when there is no conviction? The self alone is the enemy of oneself. because it always kind of, takes you in the wrong direction, because, you're not going to listen to this self. You're not going to even understand it. You're in not even a good relationship with that self. In other words, that you have no knowledge of the self. You're not even interested in the self. And therefore, there is no conquering of the mind. Therefore, there is no ability to lift oneself by one's own self. So you can see how we have to make a friend of the self and make a friend of the mind. And this mind will then take us into the right relationship with the self, and we will begin to ascend to meet our friend called the self. Okay, so going on further, the accomplished jnani. This is the one who has mounted the steed of the mind. And here are a set of kind of criteria by which we can understand who is this such a person who has mounted the steed of the mind. Self-control, jitatmanaha, peaceful, prashantaha, balanced in heat and cold, pleasure and pain, honor and dishonor. So even at all levels of our being, whether it is in the body, just like today is a very hot day, and we are thinking, oh my God, it's too hot, too hot, too hot. Balanced in heat and cold, pleasure and pain, honor and dishonor, at the level of the body and the mind and the intellect. Contented in the knowledge, wisdom, jnana, vijnana, triptatma, remains unshaken, kutastha, conquered the senses, jitendriya, to whom a lump of earth, stone, and gold are the same, to whom the good-hearted friends, relatives, the indifferent, the neutral, the hateful, the righteous, the unrighteous are the same. So you can see he has reached such a state of control of the mind, so that all aspects of the functioning of the mind are controlled not only within themselves, but also in relationship to the world of names and forms, to immaterial things like earth, stone, and gold, and material things, creatures or living beings like friends, relatives, etc. So a complete relationship change is what comes about by the one who has mounted the steed of the mind, the one who is an accomplished jnani. So remember the relationship between the accomplished jnani, the yoga rudha, the karma sannyasi, and the karma yogi. Because as we move towards the knowledge of the self and get established in the knowledge of the self, the jnani is more and more in prominence. And the jnani is the one who has completely controlled the mind. And these are the 7 things which Lord Krishna talks about in these 3 verses. These are all the criteria by which we can see who is such a person who has mounted the steed of the mind. So what are the characteristics of the purified mind? This is what I mentioned in the classes many times. In terms of the experience of the purified mind, there is Shanti, Santosh, and Samadhan, the 3 S's. In terms of the attributes of the mind, what changes? There is single-pointedness, very sharp, laser-pointed mind, which can go through anything. It can focus so intensely on something. Stillness, complete stillness of the mind, and subtleness. So remember, when we are able to renounce thought, then the mind becomes laser pointed. It's like a laser beam. It becomes so sharp. It becomes single pointed towards anything it points to, but at the same time, it can go into a state of complete stillness. And it has this attribute of detecting or becoming aware of very subtle states of consciousness, which is what is required. When you're doing meditation, these subtle states of consciousness is what one has to become aware of. But at the same time, in the transactional life, there is Shanti, there is Santosh, there is Samadhan, which is experienced. This is the purified mind. So the technique of meditation. Now let's see what the technique of meditation, these are all the kind of items which are there in relationship to the technique of meditation itself, the means of practice, the conditions and the outcomes of practice, the technique of withdrawal and centering the mind, the highest goal of the yogi, and how that is attained, and oneness and equanimity of the mind, the final goal. So, step by step, Lord Krishna is taking Arjuna to the reflection and the practice of meditation. So let's go to the first one, means of practice of meditation. Here, let the yogi constantly keep the mind steady, remain in solitude alone, control the mind and the body, keep free from hope and greed. This is the constant condition of the yogi throughout the day. Now, we are not yet sitting down for meditation. This is just a preparation throughout the day and requires a constant state of self-awareness. Remember the 4As? This is where the 4As become so important in directing our thought, feeling, and action, directing our body, mind, intellect in the right direction. And in this kind of remaining solitude doesn't mean that you are kind of on your own in that sense, but remaining solitude, as I was explaining in the Bhagavad Gita on Sunday class, solitude is about being with the self. So being in the constant company of the self, so that you are alone with the self, that is a one way of understanding solitude, which is in this context is the right understanding. So remember, for 30 minutes of effective meditation, a whole day of preparation is required. This is the 14-10-30 rule. And if you count the number of minutes in the whole day, it's 1440. And if you want to sit down for meditation for 30 minutes, you need to take care of the other 1410, even while you're sleeping or deep sleep. That is also required. So here are the 4As again, just to remind you. How is it going to be done? Conscious spiritual living, which is what Lord Krishna is talking about here. The 4As, the 4Bs, the 4Cs, and the 4Ds. I'm sure that you have now memorized all this by now, because we've been talking about it in all the sessions so far. Okay, so means of practice. For sitting in meditation, you need a clean spot, firm seat made of cloth, neither too high nor too low, skin and kusha grass, or one over the other. Now, this is a preparation which is described in the context of those times, but basically what it means is prepare a firm and a good seat, which is not, you're not sitting on top of the table, and you're not sitting underground. You're sitting on a kind of level floor, which then is the proper way of finding the seat of meditation. It has to be a clean spot, of course, because you don't want any kind of things running around while you're sitting in meditation. Make the mind one-pointed, mind and senses under control. Practice of yoga for purification of the self, me, and mind. So this is now, we can say that even meditation can be a means of purification. And people ask, do I have to wait until I get purified so that I can sit down for meditation? No, the two things can be complementary, in the sense that whatever gains you get from even a slight bit of meditation will contribute towards the purification of the me and the mind. Holding the body firmly, head and neck erect and still, gazing at the tip of the nose without looking around. Okay? So the gaze is now still, and it is at the tip of the nose, which is not the bottom part, but the top part. And the eye should be directed forward, as it were, and fixed on a point in front of you. Make the mind to be serene, fearless, firm in the vow of brahmacharya, which means, not wandering around all over the place, but wandering in Brahman. This is the meaning of brahmacharya, really, wandering in Brahman, and controlling the mind, meditating, thinking of me as the supreme goal. Now we are setting the scene for, in the physical body, in the mind, and in the attitude, in the way in which the body is become still and seated in the proper position. Now, with a serene-minded kind of attitude, one is now ready to get into the deeper state of meditation. So what are the conditions which are required? Make sure that there is moderation in eating and sleeping. Otherwise, yoga is not possible. Moderation in recreation, exertion during the actions. During actions, yoga destroys pain. So in other words, moderation in all the things we do during the transactional day-to-day life. The yogi becomes united, accomplished when controlled mind rests only in the self. This is really the idea about meditation. The mind, which is now completely still, rest in the self, free from all longing for any object or desire. Remember, desires and objects have all been given up through Sankalpa Sannyasa. And here he describes how that state of the mind is. A lamp which is placed in a windless place that does not flicker. This is the mind of the yogi. This is the controlled mind. So imagine a lamp which is in a windless space, completely kind of still. It is as if not flickering at all, and it is as if it is, absolutely still. And this is where the absorption in the mind can take place. And controlled mind attains quietude when seeing the self by the self, satisfied in the self. In this quiet stillness of the mind, when one kind of brings in the absorption of this mind into the state of stillness of the consciousness, where the mind merges with this awareness, this is where now one can say the self is seen by the self, which is the mind, and it is satisfied in the self. Remember chapter number 2, Sthita Prajna Lakshana, exactly what he's talking about here as well. So conditions again continuing, yogi feels the infinite bliss grasped by the pure intellect beyond the senses. Once established, never moves beyond this reality, moves from this reality, because it is so blissful. Just to stay in that state of meditation, people get so absorbed, they don't want to move out of it. And he says, having attained, feels nothing superior to that, and is not moved even by the heaviest sorrow. So having seen the bliss of this infinite reality and tasted it through this Brahman contact, which is going to mention about, any kind of sorrow which comes, it is seen as, it can't move me, because the mind has got absorbed in this ultimate reality. And another definition of yoga, you remember one definition of yoga is equanimity of the mind. Another definition we've already been given, dexterity in action. And here another third definition of yoga Lord Krishna gives, severance from the union with pain. Very interesting definition, because we are in union with pain at the moment. What does it mean? It means we are identified with the body-mind intellect. And what he says, disidentification is yoga. Severance from union with pain is yoga. This should be practiced with steady, determined, and undespairing mind. And for always keeping the mind balanced and controlled, the yogi attains peace, abiding in me meaning Brahman, the highest ultimate reality, and finally attaining liberation. So you remember, this was the whole object of our spiritual life, is to free ourselves from this cycle of birth and death by attaining liberation. So summary of the outcomes. Now let's look at the summary. Pain is destroyed, severance of union with pain. Yogi becomes united, accomplished, and there is a complete stillness of the mind. He sees the self, which is pure consciousness, and is satisfied in the self, and he feels infinite bliss, gets established in that Brahman, not moved even by heavy sorrow, and yogi attains peace, attains liberation. Okay, so now this is the technique of withdrawing. So coming back to how to kind of center the mind, abandoning all desires born out of mental construction. Okay, going back to, where were we? So this is a summary. So he sees the self in the satisfied in the self, feels the infinite bliss, and then the technique of withdrawal. So so he attains peace, which attains liberation. So now peace means that, he has gone beyond the body, mind, intellect, that he has moved to a point whereby the mind has totally become absorbed in the self. And this is where the ultimate peace is obtained, by being in that kind of state. So going further, then the technique of withdrawal and centering the mind. So he's coming back now to describing to us what needs to be done in order for us to center the mind. So abandon all desire born out of mental construction, sankalpa, And this is earlier what we were talking about, sankalpa sannyasa, which means totally kind of giving up the thought flow as well. And the mind has become totally peaceful and quiet and calm. Restrain all the senses by the mind from all sides. Attain quietude little by little, having established mind in the self. Think of nothing, which means there is stillness in the mind. And if the mind is restless, it becomes, active again and becomes unsteady or wanders away. Bring it back under the control, and then come back to remaining centered in the self. So this is the technique of withdrawal of the mind from all the things, and even the sankalpa itself, and then centering in the self and remaining there. If any point the mind wanders away, bring it back again and again to remain centered in the self. So this is the highest goal of the yogi, which is described in 27 and 28. Mind made peaceful, passion subdued, which means, the vasanas, desires, everything has gone, freed from sin in meditation. Now, what does this mean? It means the me and the mind has completely disappeared, because sin is a state of ignorance. Sin is functioning from the ego individuality point of view. And here it means that completely free from sin in meditation, whereby even the sense of I-ness, minus, everything has gone. And the yogi experiences the supreme bliss, having become Brahman. So he's now in that total state of absorption in Brahman. Yogi enjoys infinite bliss of Brahman contact. Brahman's samsparsham, which means that, this contact, which again and again is felt, even when you get out of seat of meditation, this Brahman contacts come back to again and again, and one feels that sense of bliss, the experience of bliss by this contact with the ultimate reality. So the parts of yoga here, as I was saying, Ashtanga Yoga, there is a similarity, and the Ashtanga Yoga of Yam, Niyam, Asan, Pranayam, Pratyahar, Dharana, Dhyan, Samadhi. These are the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. And here I've given you the kind of references in terms of the Bhagavad Gita verses in chapter number 6. So for example, regulation of the breath is also given in earlier chapter in 429, but again, he mentions about the inflowing, outflowing breath here as well. Concentration of the mind on a single point, again, related to this chapter as well. So Ashtanga Yoga, which is Dhyana Yoga, Patanjali's yoga, sometimes, people kind of take this to be one and the same thing. And the derivation of Yoga Sutra, some people argue, is from this reflection on this chapter. Okay, so the oneness and the equanimity of the mind, which is really the final goal. And with the mind harmonized, which means harmonized with what? With the self. The yogi sees self abiding in all beings and all beings in the self. Now, having reached this state in the seat of meditation and getting absorbed in the self and remaining there with the mind which is harmonized in this kind of way, when the yogi is looking around, what he sees is the self abiding in all beings and all beings in the self. He sees the same everywhere. This is samdarshana. Samdarshana means that everything is seen as oneness. Now, this is not an intellectual process which is going on. It is really the direct experience of the yogi to see this oneness in everything and this oneness in all creatures. He sees me everywhere, one in all, and he sees everything in me. Here, me meaning the self. So one in all in one. Nor is there any separation from me. See, here now he's talking about complete establishment in the self. There is no separation from the self. So the self is the me, and the me is the self, and the self is this experience of oneness, which is there all the time. And the yogi who established in oneness worships the divine in all beings, abides in me, whatever his mode of living. In other words, whatever he's doing now, transacting in the world. And remember earlier, Lord Krishna gave the example of King Janak. King Janak, he was a great king, and his mode of living was being a king and ruling a whole kingdom. And yet he is established in oneness and he abides in the self, whatever his mode of living was. So this is the supreme yogi. In oneness sees equality everywhere, whether in pain or pleasure. So whether it is the pain in the other, this is the pain in me. Whether it is the pleasure in the other, the pleasure is in me. This is the equality which is there because of this direct experience of this oneness, which is seen by the supreme yogi. So now we can do the meditation exercise. I think we lost about 4 or 5 minutes there, but this is now we can do the meditation exercise. So I want you to just take up a comfortable posture, back and neck, head in a straight line, eyes gently closed, and we will start by relaxing the body part by part, starting from the toes, the feet, ankles, lower legs, knees, upper legs, stomach, chest. Relax the shoulders, lower back, middle back, upper arms, elbows, lower arms, wrists, hands, and fingers. Relax the back of the neck, back of the head, top of the head, forehead, muscles around the eyes. Relax the jaw and the front of the neck. Now check the body as a whole to see if there's any remaining tension anywhere. Let go of all the tensions in the body. Become still, become quiet, and fix your gaze so that there is no movement of even the eyes. Complete stillness in the body, stillness in the mind. Stillness of the gaze, stillness of the mind, stillness of the body. Now take your attention to the breathing. Become aware of the body as you breathe, and become aware of the movement of air as it moves in and out of the nostrils. Just take your attention and focus completely on the breathing. Breathing in, breathing out. Focus your attention on just the sensation of the air as it moves in and out of the nostrils. And if the mind starts wandering, bring it back to the breathing. Breathing in, breathing out. Now take your attention to your feelings as they are at the moment and become aware of the feelings and just observe the feelings without controlling and without engaging. Just observe the feelings without controlling, without engaging. Stand apart, as it were, from the feelings. And now as you breathe in peace and calmness. Let the peace and the calmness settle into your feelings and feel and experience the peace and the calmness in the mind. Let go of all the other feelings and just experience the peace and the calmness in the mind. Now turn your attention to your thoughts as they are at the moment and just observe the thoughts without controlling, without engaging, and just observe the thoughts as they arise in the intellect. Become the observer of the thoughts without controlling them, without engaging. Let the thought process quieten and become still. And now as you breathe in stillness and silence. stillness in the intellect, silence in the intellect, and just observe the intellect as it goes into a state of stillness and silence. Now with a relaxed body, calm and peaceful mind, and still and silent intellect, just say to yourself, I have a body and yet I am not the body. I have a body and yet I am not the body. I have mind and feelings and yet I am not the mind nor the feelings. I have mind and feelings and yet I am not the mind nor the feelings. I have thoughts in the intellect and yet I am not the thoughts nor the intellect. I have thoughts in the intellect and yet I am not the thoughts nor the intellect. I am the observer of the sensations in the body, feelings in the mind, and thoughts in the intellect. I am the witness of the body, mind, and intellect. I am the pure witness, the pure self. Let your mind, which is calm and quiet, which is still, rest in the self. Resting in the self, you are the self. Just stay with that sense of self, which is pure existence, pure consciousness, pure bliss. Just stay with that sense of being. You are nothing but the self, Brahman, which is Sat, pure existence, Chit, pure consciousness, Ananda, pure bliss. You are that. Just stay with that sense of being. Okay, now bring your attention back to the breathing. Become aware of the body as you breathe. Become aware of where you're sitting, sounds around you, people around you. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes. So this then is a kind of demonstration of what Lord Krishna talks about in this chapter called Dhyana Yoga. And you remember that we do this, we have done this in all the talks in the previous sessions. And this is something which is also available on YouTube as an exercise in itself, and you can look it up. It is available on YouTube, and if you want, I can post the link to it on the group, and so that everybody can kind of practice doing this kind of meditation, which is Advaita Vedantic meditation, which is different from other types of meditation, and it just goes straight into absorption in the self. Okay, so now Arjuna is ready with his question and he expresses a doubt. He says, this yoga of evenness of the mind you're talking about, taught by you, Madhusudana, I don't think it can continue because of the fickleness of the mind. You are saying that I can, have this evenness of the mind, I can control the mind and it remains there, it remains quiet, it remains still, it remains in a calm state of mind. He says, I don't think that's possible because of the very nature of the mind, fickleness of the mind. This mind is unyielding, strong, turbulent, as difficult to control as the wind, and restless. Now, this is what you may have experienced in this very short meditation exercise. You might have seen, the mind is restless, it just runs away. It's strong, unyielding, very difficult to control. And this is what we mean by mounting the steed. That steed has to be mounted. And this is what Lord Krishna is talking about when he says complete control of the mind. But Arjuna is expressing it out. He says, no, I don't think this is going to be possible. So Lord Krishna says, no doubt the mind is difficult to control and restless, Arjuna. But by abhyas, practice, and vairagya, dispassion, it can be restrained. So he is acknowledging that there is a problem. He knows what the problem is, and he has already, it has already been hinted at by Arjuna, very kind of clear understanding of how the mind behaves. And Lord Krishna is saying, yes, I agree with you that it's difficult to control and restless, but there is a way out. There is a solution, and this is by abhyas and vairagya. It can be restrained. Yoga, I think, is hard to be attained by uncontrol. If there is no control, then yoga is going to be very difficult. But for self-control, the one who is striving, it is possible by the proper means. So here, Lord Krishna is giving Arjuna the solution. So abhyas and vairagya. Now, I look at it from this point of view. There are 3 levels of change. You can change a habit, you can change a mindset, and you can have a paradigm shift. And all this can be part and parcel of thinking about our own framework of change. And this is something which you can reflect on. And the context of change is what? Meaning, purpose, values, which is derived from the philosophy and the knowledge in the Bhagavad Gita, which begins to change our belief and attitude and intention in relationship to the true self, in relationship to the world, in relationship to oneself. Okay, this is the context of the change. And the process of change is by abhyas and vairagya. This is what Lord Krishna is saying, that through abhyas and vairagya, in this context of the path of knowledge, it is about shravanam, mananam, nididhyasanam, and the 4 A's, B's, C's, and D's, which we have already talked about. And then the means of change. These are the means of change, the 9 tools of the toolkit: vivek, vairagya, satsampati, which are the 6 disciplines, and mumukshutva. So all of those combined together gives you 9 tools of the toolkit, which we need to use on a day-to-day basis. When we talk about the preparation of the mind for meditation, this is what we are going to be using moment to moment, day to day in our lives, so that the mind becomes purified and it becomes ready enough to even give up the thought process itself. And sitting down in the seat of meditation, this is another means of change: concentration, contemplation, and meditation. So remember these frameworks of change. I've got another list of another 3 or 4 different frameworks, which I'm going to present in the next one. But for the time being, this is what you need to kind of think about. How do I understand each one of these frameworks for practice? How can I refine my sadhana to move further on this path? What can I change? What specific techniques I need to use? What can I use on a daily basis? And what is the experience of using these techniques? Already you will have worked through this for the other techniques which have already been given, but these are another few techniques of meditation. So Arjuna then asked another question. He says, even having faith, one wanders away from the path and fails to attain perfection. What happened to such a yogi? Because we know that the mind is fickle and it can just go off in a different direction. And although you have started off on the journey of spirituality and you've gone some way along it, and all of a sudden you find something takes your attention away, takes your life away into a different direction, and therefore you fail to attain perfection. So what happens then? Because is everything lost, he says, fallen from both worlds, neither the world of transactions nor the world of spirituality? You can't have anything. You're neither here nor there. Does he not perish like a rent cloud, without support, deluded in the path of yoga? Okay, so this is his concern now. This is his anxiety. He says, what happens if I don't attain this final, destination while I'm in this body, mind, intellect, while I'm in this individuality? Suppose life comes to an end, then what happens? So to dispel this doubt, he says, you are the only one who can dispel it, because I know that you are the one with the knowledge. So Bhagwan says there is no destruction for such a person, neither in this world nor the next. Such a clear assurance to all of us, saying that if you're already on this path, there is no destruction for you, because sooner or later you are going to attain the destination. He says, none who strives to be good ever comes to any grief. Okay. And I've seen it in my own life that, this kind of grief, it doesn't affect you, like you were saying, this sorrow which comes in our life, it doesn't shake you as it used to before. Having attained the world of righteousness, dwelling there for a long time, and the one fallen from yoga brashta. So, you've done some good, right? You've done some righteousness. So you rise to the heavens, to the upper worlds. And then when the time is right, you can stay there for a long time, but then you have to come back because the load of karma has not yet completely been exhausted or burnt out. So then you are born again because you've done so much righteousness, so much good, so much punya. Then you're born in the house of a pure and a wealthy family. Okay? Which means already you're on the path, because already the surrounding and the atmosphere and the people are there to help you to continue on the journey. And even rarer, he says, is the one born in the family of the wise yogis, because they are already practicing and very much further along in the pathway. So you get a great boost, a birth that is very difficult to obtain in this world. Because in the first place, yogis who are really sannyasis don't even get married, but there are people who are there. And to be born in such a family is absolutely fortunate. Very difficult to obtain, but it is absolutely fortunate. And Bhagwan says, there the yogi comes to be united with the knowledge acquired in the former body and strives once more. So the very fact that you are here listening to this knowledge is because you have already done that in your past life. And here we continue our journey. And he says he gets carried forth despite himself by the former practice, because the force of this goodness is so strong, it will propel you in the right direction. Even if one wishes to know more about yoga, eventually he goes beyond the Shabda Brahman created universe. Okay. So even just to know about yoga eventually will take you into the transcendental reality. Through many births, striving persistently, purified of sin, me and mine, perfected through many births, this yogi goes to the highest goal. This is Param Gatim. Okay? This is the highest goal of the yogi, is to be completely absorbed in the self, totally realized, released from the cycle of birth and death, into a state of Kaivalya, liberation. And he becomes a Jivan Mukta, whilst liberated whilst living. Okay. So introducing the next chapter, Lord Krishna then 46-47 in his usual style gives us the introduction to the next chapter. He says the yogi is superior to the ascetic is superior to the learned, who has intellectual knowledge, and who is superior to the men of action, active in ritual. So therefore he says, strive to be a yogi. Therefore he's giving the rationale behind striving to become a yogi. He says the yogi is the highest, most superior. Whether you start with karma yoga, this is even higher than the ascetic and the learned and the men of action. And he says the most devout yogi, in other words, the highest yogi, is the one who has full faith, with his inner self merged in me, worships me. This is now he's taking Arjuna into the understanding of divinity itself. Okay. So he starts by the Jnana Vijnana and takes him further along right up to chapter number 12, the Yoga of Devotion. So the whole of divinity is unfolded for Arjuna in those next 6 chapters. And this is what Lord Krishna is going to take him through in understanding what his relationship to the ultimate reality, which is a transcendental reality, and the transactional divinity, how that can be related to in the proper manner. Okay. So what will you do now? This is your homework. Read it up and then plan your day and plan your life and plan all the techniques which you're going to use throughout the day, and especially meditation. Intensify the plan if you're already meditating, or create a graduated plan of meditation if you don't already have one, and incorporate all this teaching and learning in your life. Enjoy the sadhana, stay safe, keep well. Thank you. And we'll conclude with the prayers.